Hello and welcome to Volumetric Fog of The Last of Us Part 2. My name is Artem Kovalovs, I'm a programmer for Naughty Dog. This talk is going to be about how we implemented our volumetric fog and the lessons we learned. The implementation was inspired by Ronsky, Hilaire, and other games that have been using this particular approach. We're going to discuss just the algorithms and how we did the lighting optimizations and dealing with the artifacts. Motivation for us was we need to create a volumetric grid to properly integrate with the world and alpha objects. Before, we just had a 2D grid and 2D overlay basically that we marched through, but ultimately it was very limiting. Here we wanted to have a better way to create a density, participating media, and have the contribution from the sun, runtime lights, ambient lights, and we want to reuse the lighting for particles. Here's a concept art for what we wanted, what we got, what we wanted, what we got, what we wanted, what we got, what we wanted with the runtime lights, what we got with the runtime lights. Um, Another shot. So we got pretty close to what we wanted. So we were pretty happy with this. So let's look at what we did. So before we just had the idea of, we would march through the world, but we would combine everything into a 2D overlay. And of course, that didn't blend very well with alpha objects. You can only render before or after particles. It was basically just another sprite. So that didn't work very well. Of course, also results could not be used for other particles, for lighting anything else. So we had to move on to the 3D grid, a volumetric grid, like others have already done, and that gives us ability to look up a 3D information that we then can apply it on top of a particle whenever it renders on top of fog. We use a standard approach of fitting a 3D texture into a frustum grid with a exponential depth function. View space voxel is a Froxel, terminology-wise. As far as the scattering and accumulation, it's pretty straightforward. Light scatters through the media. We have a custom scattering function to evaluate for light, direction to versus light to Froxel and Froxel to the camera. We evaluate the scattering there. It's a custom artist-driven function. We use a formula proposed by Hilaire in terms of outgoing radiance, the Froxel, and based on scattered light extinction and Froxel depth. Resolution goes. We knew that we couldn't achieve, like a half resolution God rays that we would get with previous fog, but we wanted to make sure we support these high resolutions in general to be able to crank it up whenever we needed to. So our default resolution was 240 by 135 by 64, which was 2 million Froxels, which ends up being 8 by 8 pixels. We also could, crank up to 5 by 5 pixel Froxels, which was 5.3 million Froxels, or go to 12 by 12, which is zero point 0.9 million Froxels. We did not use the 4 by 4. Though it was supported, we never actually used it. So we definitely need to implement a lot of optimizations. We had a accumulation texture, the final fog texture, which was an RGBA texture of FP16 with alpha for transmittance and pre-multiplied combined and scattered lighting in RGB. For runtime light, we used a one frame lifetime texture for RGBA U8. We have two temporal shadow with two channels, one for temporal sun shadow, the other one for temporal runtime light shadow. We're going to talk about that. We had one for participating media temporal texture, and we had a different scale or different resolution texture for FP16 texture for ambient lighting, where RGB was ambient color or ambient light, and alpha was plus minus density. Here's the same information in the table form. You will see that with higher resolution, memory footprint becomes pretty high. As far as density authoring is concerned, we were able to add density multiple ways. We had layers where you have start distance, end distance, start height to end height, stuff like that. We had sky fog layer, we had fog regions, volumetric particles, Heightmap Fog, default volumes. So volumetric particles, very standard. We just have particles that are spawned within our regular particle system that we just write into the volumetric grid. They're pretty simple. Per tile basis, we would know which particles intersect with particular tile, and for every tile, for each particle, we would add the contribution based on where we are in the particle as a sphere, plus evaluation of a texture. For Heightmap Fog, we wanted to implement this fog on top of surfaces, not just the ground, but also cars, to simulate the effect of rain splashes kind of generating this mist on top of the surface. And you will notice it's on top of the cars. It's fairly it's subtle, right? So, but that's the whole point. That's why it looks good. So we have we did this, we have the fog sitting on top of the surfaces. So what do? We capture height map only on tag geometry, and the height map itself is not high resolution and it covers large space. So we would have this problem of aliasing and just in general low resolution grid. So what we did is we used whenever we intersect the Froxel with the height, instead of using just regular height, we use the exponential height map, similar to using exponential shadow maps, and that allows us to for smoother blending. And you can see that the very big difference in terms of the visual look when we use exponential height map. Much better, allows us to blend and interpolate, and it looks much better. Uh, Fog regions. So here's an example of Heightmap Fog. Fog regions were able to add and remove density. It's a complex shape that ultimately ends up being a bunch of convex regions. It also allows us to tint and color probes. All of that is done in the ambient lighting pass with lower resolution. With fog regions, basically every Froxel will check whether or not it's inside of the region. Based on that, call the probes or add density and remove density. For example, in this particular case, we have a blizzard going outside, so there's a lot of fog outside, yet we cut out all that fog from the inside by using a region. So moving on to ambient lighting. Ambient lighting was a huge part of this game, very, very important. This ambient and direct lighting of the fog, because a lot of the levels are really, really, really atmospheric, right? We want to feel the atmosphere, and it all comes from indirect lighting. So what did we do there? Well, it's extremely important for our game. Here's a couple of screenshots. So what did we do? We, you know, we wanted to reuse our KD tree for our ambient probes. And basically for every Froxel, we would just go through KD tree and grab the list of closest probes. We just have like a list of 10 or something. And then after we're done going through the KD tree, we would go through each probe and evaluate it. That became extremely, extremely slow, right? The latency on that would be crazy. The reason was that because of the high divergence of for Froxels, they will start taking different paths, and there was also high VGPR count, which led to low occupancy. So we sometimes use a lot of probes, and temporal jitter didn't really help much with that. It still looked pretty bad. So we want to make sure we want to evaluate all probes around the Froxel, not just the smallest like list of 10. We want to have contribution of all of them. We also want to need a better algorithm, and we want to get rid of the state divergence issue. So the one solution, of course, is to pre-process the KD tree into some sort of BVH structure where we have larger volumes than Froxel that will kind of store which probes intersect with that. But actually, surprisingly, we didn't need to do that. We actually were able to. We didn't do a separate pass or store a separate texture or anything like that, or a separate table or some sort of a grid hash. Instead of spatial hash, we just did it all in one shader. But the way we did it was, every wavefront is 64 threads. That means it's responsible for a 4x4x4 grid of Froxels. For that, we just calculate one common sphere, right? That is common to all threads within the wavefront. And then we use that sphere to go through the KD tree. Because it's common to all the threads, that means it's a scalar operation. So we, in scalar fashion, go through the KD tree, and we grab the list of up to 192 probes by using 3 VGPRs. So in scalar fashion, go through the list, and we keep adding into 3 VGPRs. So we only get a list of 192 probes, but only with the cost of 3 VGPRs. To do it even more efficiently and use SLU as much as possible, we converted the KD tree into fixed math format, which is just integers. That way we could use SLU for everything because SLU doesn't have floating point operations. So the optimized algorithm, you will see that we just go in scalar fashion, we assemble that list, and after that list is done, we can actually, in parallel fashion now, within 3 iterations, process all of the probes within that have the same test, for example, occlusion towards camera, and then from there, every thread picks and goes through those lists to pick out the probes that they need. So we have this coarse pass as part of the same shader. Great occupancy, yield great occupancy because the VGPR count dropped dramatically, and you will see that we also are using instruction level overlap because SLU is not used by anything else, so we or not as much by normal GPU execution. So we cranked up the SLU performance. So it was a good overlap, yielded in great performance. I believe 0.2 or 0.3 milliseconds is what we ended up with. Here's an example of this big radius is what we're considering within those 192 probes, and then this particular Froxel these are the probes it's going to grab, and the results are convincing, and we were really happy with it. Of course, we also use a low resolution grid for ambient. We don't need high resolution like for guard rays or anything like that. Temporal filtering, low GPR counts, just low GPR counts let us to be able to overlap it very efficiently. So then moving on to sunlight, right? Sunlight is another example where it was really important for us. And what do we do for sunlighting? Of course, we want to reuse the cascade shadow maps, right, for the Froxel lighting. Except the Froxel lighting, sampling cascades is actually pretty costly. So instead, we just used what we had from before. We just improved on it, which was a shadow cache that was made by Finchuan Wang, who left Naughty Dog. But thank you very much, Finchuan, for the contribution. The idea is that we just project our view space into a 2D cone on a plane perpendicular to the lights to the light source, and then we create this is a kind of M by N texture where it's basically slices. Every row in a texture is a slice of in this particular cone, and that's where we cache the shadow into. We actually store 2 frame worth of shadow, so we can do a max of that to stabilize from the jitter, and then we actually store it as exponential shadow map for sampling when we're actually lighting the Froxels. So we do temporal jitter, like that's just like a 2 frame kind of history, and we use a exponential shadow maps for that. As was proposed by Wronski. That gives us sun lighting within the cascade range, but we need a solution for the outside of the cascade range. For that, we use shadow snapshot. Here's how it looks. It's basically a big snapshot of the shadow from a large distance that covers large distance, and we use that as a fallback to lighting Froxels. And all of that goes into the same sun shadow cache. It's just instead of adding data from cascades, we add data from this cache. It's captured every so often. It doesn't have any impact on performance. Could also, I guess, do it statically, capture it ahead of time, but it's nice to be able to dynamically recapture it as the camera moves. For as far as like when we actually do the lighting, for every Froxel we sample up to 4 times to multi-sample our shadow cache because our Froxels are pretty deep, and that gives us results. And of course, there's going to be issues like the noise that we just saw in the screenshot, and that's because we need temporal filtering. So we use temporal filtering with jitter depth-wise and screen space-wise to get more values and do more multi-sampling and apply temporal filtering on top of it as proposed by many others. And temporal, of course, was introduced by Keres. So we go from kind of this noisy result to a really good result, right? And here's a little video of that. So obviously temporal works really well in this particular case. Moving on to runtime lighting. So runtime light, of course, is extremely important for us too. We have these dark scenarios. We have all kinds of different lights. We have torches. We have flares. We have flashlights, and it's all within these foggy or dusty spore environments that we really important to get this look right. So the idea is that, of course, we cannot use temporal for lights, right? Because lights are moving, so they would ghost like crazy, right? So we would need to produce information within 1 frame, and yeah, unfortunately, it's very hard to analytically integrate light. So we need to do a bunch of multi-sampling, and that would be very expensive. And again, even with multi-sampling, it still doesn't produce good results as camera is moving forward and backwards. You can see the discontinuity. So we want to pre-calculate as much as possible as like proposed by Hubler. So we had 3 different point lights. It was 3 different types of lights: point light, ortho light, and spotlight. Ortholights are the simplest ones. They are just boxes that we our Froxel line goes from the camera origin and goes along, and there's multiple Froxels slice by slice by slice. That Froxel line will intersect 2 locations, and we're just gonna purely integrate it. If we look at the point light, we can see that whenever Froxel line is intersecting with the point light, it will generate. We can generate a disk that goes through the center of the point light and the 2 intersection points. No matter how we intersect, we can generate a disk through the center of that light source, right? So what that means is we can pre-integrate a texture that is that disk in the center, and we can only use one direction for that because no matter how we intersect, we can always rotate that disk in the direction of that particular intersection ray. What about spotlights? Well, if we look at how we intersect spotlights, you can notice that no matter how we intersect, we can always build a triangle that goes through the center origin of the light source and two of the points that we intersect through. So no matter what 2 points are, we can always build this triangle that has an edge at the base of this shape, and also is goes through the center of the light source. So what does that mean? That means we can potentially pre-integrate those triangles. So let's look at the center intersection. For the center intersection, we have one triangle, and we have all kinds of direction of entry and exit directions, right? So if we were to pre-integrate one direction of this triangle, right, this up direction, that would kind of handle all of these cases going up in this triangle. So to integrate all the directions going through this triangle, we need multiple textures, right? So we create one 3D texture, a 64 by 64 by 96. 96 came from testing. And that allows us to pre-integrate all directions intersecting this particular plane. Of course, we need to have multiple planes too, because we actually have multiple of these triangles that make up the cone, right? So of course, we gonna have multiple 3D textures, right? Or we can combine it all into one 3D texture. But for every slice, we had 3D texture, and 8 slices. Last slice was just black, and that allowed us to kind of pre-integrate the whole triangle. As far as the pre-computation and the algorithm in general, what we would do is for every group of Froxels, 8 by 8 in screen space, for every Froxel, we would first calculate which light sources that does this Froxel line intersect with. Then that would be combined into together into a kind of like a common list for the whole group and per slice. So every group per slice would know which light sources also intersects with, and not only that, also which types of lights intersects with. Okay, and then the intersection data per Froxel line itself would be the intersection depth start and end, and UV coordinate in that pre-integrated texture start at the depth 0 of the camera depth 0, and what is the UV change of rate of the UV. For spotlights, it's the direction and the slice coordinate, and for ortho lights, it's just the distance and approach rate to each one of those planes. And then after pre-computation is done, for like whenever we're executing a 8 by 8, 64 thread wavefront, it just looks up the group within that slice of what light sources are you intersecting with, and then and we in scalar, it has to be a scalar operation to make it efficient. We loop through the light sources that particular group is intersecting, and then we are evaluating very quickly using that intersection data. We can reconstruct where that Froxel is relative to the light source and what it's actually intersecting with. And then we do the lighting. So once we know for Froxel, okay, here's how much I'm intersecting with the point light. We just also do the sampling of the pre-integrated texture. We sample the beginning and the end. We take the difference, and that is going to be our integral. We can go either direction. End minus for beginning or beginning minus end doesn't matter. It's the same result. Here's a video result of the how the point lights look, right? So you have a fall off from the core, and you have multiple point lights here. We have, again, looks nice and soft, exactly what we wanted. For spotlight integration, it's similar approach, just a little bit different because we need to sample two textures, right? So we know which slices we're intersecting with basically, and we know the blend in between them. So we just sampled two of those triangles. We do the integral of sampling and the beginning, subtract, we get the integral for both those triangles, and we just manually blend based on the fraction of the slice that we're given. And the results again look very convincing. We have a nice core in the middle. We have a fall off towards the edges of the light, and based on the distance too. Ortho lights are simplest. They actually don't need any texture because we just do analytical integration with linear fall off from the planes. That becomes a simple quadratic just based on the linear fall off of how you're intersecting. Here's an example. We have an ortho light going through this window. We have another ortho light in the other room. So as far as the implementation details are concerned for this, we want to make sure that we use a compression or the gamma or power of 2 compression on these textures to make sure that the low values get higher precision. We could technically use half of the directions, but that messes with, again, because we want to use the smaller values. It's nice to have all the directions. If you're going to use U8 texture, if you want to use the FP16, you could just use half the directions. So for U8, you want to use all precisions. You could also potentially do half of the triangle, but it would be a little painful to figure out like what to do when the Froxel is going through the center of the triangle, because then you would need to do twice as many samples. We could also use, instead of having multiple 3D textures, have one big 3D texture. You can do that. The benefit of having multiple 3D textures is that you can actually have different resolutions for different textures if you want to. You could also try doing through a 4D blend by putting the slices as different MIPS for the 3D texture. So what do we do for runtime light shadow? We downsample the shadows. We use either regular or exponential shadow maps for that, and we multi-sample whenever we're lighting the Froxels. The big question is, can we use temporal for the shadows? We know we cannot use temporal for the light source, but can we use temporal for the shadows themselves? And the answer is, for us, we actually did use it, and even though the lights move, the shadow doesn't move as much. So how can we use temporal for shadows, right? So we put the shadow, we put temporal on the shadow only. So what do we do? For every light, whenever the Froxel is within the light's reach, doesn't matter if it's in shadow or not, it will affect the RGB value of the light runtime light texture, right? So all of the lights will affect. So in this particular case, light 1 here, it is not, this Froxel is in shadow for that light source. However, we're still going to affect the RGB value as if it was not shadowed. However, we keep track of all of that, and we calculate one combined shadow value for this particular Froxel, right? So you can see that we are affecting by light 0 and not affecting by light 1. Well, we're going to affect the RGB value, but our shadow value is going to be 0.55, right? So we're going to get not necessarily correct color, but we're going to get correct intensity. That's good news about it. We can put temporal on it, and it's great visual improvement as expected, right? Instead of noisy, flickering, light shafts, if we turn on temporal, we're gonna get smooth results, right? What's not so good? The light crosstalk, what we talked about before. Every light is gonna be, even if it's the Froxels and shadow is still gonna affect the tint of the light source. So, but the intensity is correct, and in fact, usually the colors are not that different that you would even notice. So most of the time, it's not an issue. But what if it was an issue? In this particular case, you see that we have this big cone light coming through this grid, through this fence, and here you can see that there is completely in shadow, so there should be no red in here at all, because this light is not affecting this area at all. Yet Dina's flashlight here, character Dina's flashlight here, is red, right? And that is because of that tinting, that extra tinting that's happening, because we are affecting the Froxel even though it's shadowed. So what can we do? A possible solution is just say per light source, because of this RGBA way and alpha is the shadow, we could say, you know what, for this particular light, don't do shadow at all. Just do, don't write color whenever you're in shadow, right? So you just don't write less values into the RGB value, right? So don't even use the alpha channel. Basically, if you're in shadow, just add 0, 0, 0 for RGB, no problem, right? The only issue there is the temporal. You're going to lose temporal, right? Because now you're just producing all the results contribution for that light source, just go straight into the RGB values. That will lose temporal, but maybe that's okay. The other option is just to adjust your light shape, maybe point it away so it doesn't have this issue. The other option is just to ignore this issue. Not really an option for us. So what did we do in our case? We wanted to kind of get a hybrid solution. So we definitely don't want to write RGB values for the areas where the light source is not affecting. But the question is but we want to still use temporal. So where can we decide not to write the RGB values, right? That is where we don't really care about temporal, and that is where, and also, by the way, visually, it only matters whenever we visually see, like, there's absolutely no reason this light should be affecting tint, right? Because it's completely in shadow. It's in the Froxel's in shadow, and everything around it is in shadow, right? So how can we answer that question, that the Froxel's in shadow, everything else is around in the shadow? If that we can answer that, then we can say, all right, in this particular case, we're just going to write 0, 0, 0 plus 0 into our RGBA values instead of lighting value plus shadow term. So that the information that we can get, the data that we can get information from is variance shadow maps. So that's what we do. We downsample our texture, we create a variance shadow map, and we blur it. That gives us ability to say, okay, this particular Froxel, the probability of it being in shadow is really, really high, and on top of it, the variance is low. That gives us that determination that this particular Froxel is in the shadow, nobody around it is in light, like everybody around it is in shadow. Then whenever, and it's a range, right? We can, it's not a step function, it's actually a range, and we can, in that case, just say, okay, in those cases, just write 000 into RGB. And that works great. And then in this particular case, her flashlight becomes white now, because in this particular area, that light source is not contributing anything to the grid at all. That texture could also be technically static and pre-computed ahead of time if you don't care about dynamic occluders. So in this is the video. We have nice temporal happening on the light source, yet in this area, that light source doesn't contribute anything, and her flashlight is nice and grayish and whitish. So another consequence, of course, of this approach is that we need to do all the lighting in one pass, because we use the UA texture. If FP16 wouldn't be a problem, but because it's a UA texture, we need to create a shadow term, and that is, with 8 bits, it's low precision, right? So we need to make sure we get all the lights together, and we calculate that shadow value, and then so we can utilize the precision. Because if we were to do light by light by light and writing from that Froxel, we would be losing more and more precision. So that is big consequence on performance, right? Because now we need to execute an Uber shader to support all the lights, because for one Froxel, we just have one chance to process all the lights affecting that Froxel. Here's another example of this, runtime light shadow thing. It's pretty responsive, because we can also adjust the temporal rules because we do multi-sampling. We can predict fairly well whether or not there's supposed to be shadow or not, and kind of converge faster based on that. So for optimizations, there's a lot of computation involved and memory operation involved when we're doing Froxel processing, right? And then if our Froxels were like under 1 million, maybe it wouldn't be that big of a deal. But when we go 2 million or more, 1.3 million even, everything starts costing, right? Everything starts costing. Memory operation or even memory clear starts costing something whenever we have big textures like that. So multi-pronged approach for optimization, of course. We want to use async compute. Obviously, we want to overlap this with the with geometry information, like Wronski proposed, or of course, what we do with compute jobs anyway. Custom shaders for different situations. We don't want to be paying extra register costs for things that we're not actually doing. We want to split work between multiple shaders to avoid big shaders for better overlap. We use Temporal. And the other thing is, of course, in our case, we didn't want to do any work that is not needed. And that is the one that is very important to talk about. Only processing visible Froxels, because that's a big change. Every optimization is a can of worms. Antoine once told me, our lighter, that it seems like you're playing a huge game of whack-a-mole, because anytime you do something, something else breaks. That's not great, but that's what we had to deal with. So different passes. This is how we structured everything. We were to do all the processing along the G buffer after the depth path is done. And we would do compositing, and then we do alpha pass, and then that would look up the 3D texture. Computing visible only. So we need to actually make a decision whether or not we're going to compute Froxels behind geometry, because if you actually do that, you're saving yourself a lot of headache. So our approach was to actually not do anything behind the geometry. So how do we go about that? So we first of all look at the depth buffer. We looked at the H tile. We can also just look at the depth values. We did the H tile as Wronski suggested, and based on that, we know how far Froxels go, right? Depending on depending on the resolution of Froxels, you might need to look at multiple H-tile, but ultimately we know how far the Froxels go. We also need to dilate that value of how far Froxels goes, because whenever we're going to be sampling Froxel, we're going to be sampling the neighbors. Even if the neighbor is not visible, it might need to still be calculated, because it's going to be sampled because of the blending. So to avoid any work at all, we're gonna do dispatch and direct calls, and we're gonna put all the Froxels that are potentially visible or are gonna be sampled into their own little buckets, right? And those buckets will be executing. We're gonna put them to different buckets depending on what they need to do, so we can execute different type of shader for each one of the buckets to again optimize for performance. Yeah, so here's an example. We have a Froxel that is lit by sunlight and is lit by spotlight. So that Froxel is going to go into the sun bucket and it's going to go into spotlight bucket. This guy here is not lit by anything, so it's just going to go into a no sun, and it doesn't need to be processed by runtime lights at all. Classification, right? We look at the 8x8 groups, right? So because we need to ultimately execute 64 thread wavefronts, and then we kind of find whatever the common, whatever the kind of a union of all the properties are for the Froxel, and then we put it in that particular bucket. So spotlights, and remember, whenever we were doing the pre-processing for light sources, we were storing the bit mask of what kind of light sources are affecting the Froxel group, and that could mean point light, spotlights, shadow, non-shadow, and all that, and we use that for classification. So here's an example of how this particular, these Froxels everywhere here were split between, spotlight with shadow, point light with shadow, and spot and point light with shadow, and so on, and that makes a big difference. Performance-wise, because now we're going to be executing very specific shaders, especially with the runtime lights, because it is change the Uber shader is we don't need the Uber shader anymore. We need Uber shader only whenever one Froxel is affected by like all kinds of different light sources. But whenever Froxel is affected by small some light sources, we can run a very specialized shader for it. And shadow versus now shadow, right? That reduces the amount of VGPRs, which means we can overlap much faster. It's not just the amount of instructions you execute; it's also the amount of GPRs in general that are used. So for better overlap. So all of this is really important. So we achieved much better occupancy, faster execution, was huge improvement, and we were able to go from 10 by 10 pixel from 1.3 million grid to 2 million grid by 8 by 8 pixels by just doing that, and performance stayed the same. So classification delay, one thing is that you have to wait for the depth buffer to be done to then be able to classify all those Froxels, right? What we were able to do was just we can also reproject that texture that we have that stores per Froxel depth, screen space per depth of how far we go. We can just reproject and use kind of a conservative approach of reprojection and predict which Froxels are going to be visible this particular frame. And that prediction is harmless if you, the only issue is like if you predict way further than it's actually visible, you're going to do some extra work, right? But if you do conservative, it was pretty harmless. You were able to predict pretty well. We were able to predict pretty well which Froxels are going to be visible, and what data can we use? What can we do? What kind of work can we do for this predicted Froxels? Well, we can use density fill-in that doesn't need any kind of depth processing. Non-shadow runtime lights. We don't need to wait for the shadows for the runtime lights. If you don't have any sun, nodes beyond cascades or something like that, where you don't have sun in there, you can pre-calculate it early. We don't need to wait for the sun shadow. Can even use previous shadow cache if you want to. I had that for a while, but I took it out. But technically, it was working that you could actually light, because the sun shadow itself is temporal. You could light these predicted Froxels with previous frames combined shadow. And so you can do the work early. All of that allows you to also overlap during the depth-only pass, which is great. Again, let's think about now processing only visible Froxels and temporal. What does it do for temporal? If we're gonna do in processing, doesn't mean we can still do temporal, right? We can still do a very simple shader that's just gonna maintain values behind geometry, whatever they were before. So that kind of gives us at least a little bit of some valid data behind, right? But the data will be stale and also will be an issue whenever you rotate the camera and suddenly you're revealing data behind the geometry. You would actually need to do full processing on top. That was our approach from in the beginning, but we ultimately went away from it, and we literally do not do anything at all. We keep the Froxels complete garbage behind the geometry. And that starts becoming an issue whenever we do temporal, because we cannot just blindly look up a value from previous frame, right? If the value was within the view, it doesn't mean it was actually visible, because it could be behind the geometry, it could be garbage. So when we do temporal filtering, we need to look at the previous frames, that 2D texture of how far the Froxels went, and we look at that and we see, okay, the Froxel we're trying to sample, was it visible? If it was visible, that means that the depth was dilated and its neighbors were visible, so we can safely sample it. If it was dilated visible, meaning it was only visible because it was dilated, we can only sample that Froxel at the center of the Froxel, because we don't know what the neighbors are okay. It could be also just not visible. And also for all those visible cases, we also need to look at if it was the last slice of the visible Froxels, in which case we can only sample up to 0.5 and adjust our sampling position up to 0.5 for that particular Froxel. And that allows us to kind of squeeze out as much information as possible from the previous frame. So that's great, and the newly revealed information just basically gets a 1.0 blend for temporal. That's fine. However, you start seeing artifacts because of the jitter, because the fact that when one frame we don't get full information, you will start seeing ghosting, depending on like what frame you were, what the pattern is for the temporal jitter. You will get different values, and then those values stick around for a while, because temporal takes a while to converge properly. So you will see this issue. So what can we do? So well, one thing to make it better is we do know in the shader that the blend value uh, is 1.0, right? So that means we can do more multi-sampling. We can say, okay, we're gonna do more samples, and together with better quality. We also gonna do potentially what we were doing is we use previous frames information, previous frames shadow cache, and we reproject our current positions into that frame and sample that. So we kind of get two multi-sampled values from this frame and the current frame, from the current frame and the last frame, and get those two, blend those two together to get kind of better understanding of what the Froxel was, and that does give better results. You will see in this video now. You don't really get the wrong information. You still see ghosting, but that ghosting comes from the fact that temporal blurs things together, and as you move the camera because of the depth of the voxels, the kind of blending happening and blurring is happening. So we still see ghosting. It's not wrong information. It's just less blurry information, right? It's just kind of sharper information. It doesn't look like some values that were hit with temporal yet. So what do we do? So the different information is not it's not wrong. It's just not blurry enough. So our solution is whenever we are doing this, we say, oh, the blend is 1.0, so we're going to do the multi-sampling part. We also actually generate a list of Froxels to be blurred, right? It's a list of Froxels that are expensive Froxels, right? They are going to be blurred. So as we do the temporal, we spit out a list of not Froxel groups, but individual Froxels that will go into a special list. And then that list, after all, that is the list of Froxels we'll do a lot of multi-sampling in. Then we run a blur pass on them to blur those Froxels. And then we do our final accumulate. That gives us results that we were looking for. It is almost indistinguishable where the new revealed Froxels are and where they're not. Because of that additional blurring. Another detail is as you're blurring, it's not only the X, you have to be very careful how you blur depth-wise. In fact, when we're generating that list of Froxels to blur, we store the fraction of where we are in the Froxel to only blur between forward slice or the backward slice, and how much to blur it by, because if you were to just blur with front and back because of the depth differences, you could get weird smearing forward and backwards as the camera is moving and you're revealing new information. So yeah, that these results look great. We were able to basically do the thing what we wanted to do, which would do zero processing for invisible Froxels, and whenever they're finally revealed, we reconstruct them, and they're reconstructed so it looks like they don't ghost very much. It doesn't look like they ghost at all, actually. For edge smearing, that's something that Ronsky brought up, and is just something to mention, is that whenever you're sampling outside, like if you have you're doing temporal and you're revealing information, and that information was not part of the texture at all from previous frame, you cannot just kind of clamp to the previous texture, closest point in the previous texture, because then you will smear the values. Instead, you just have to apply 1.0 blend if you're sampling outside of the previous view and not close enough, not within the half. I believe we used half of the Froxel size to be able to use previous frames previous frame state texture. So other artifacts that we had, light aliasing versus Froxel depth, right? So you will see in this video, as we're moving the camera back and forth, you will start seeing this patterning on the lights. And the issue is, of course, because how the light source intersects the Froxel. The Froxel's depth is pretty large, right? So you might have light source intersect center of the Froxel, just affect 1, versus intersect 2. And that visually will look different when we're actually accumulating and when we're actually applying the transmittance of depth to depth to depth with the lighting, and that's where you get these patterns from. Our solution was to basically kind of cover all these situations, how light could intersect one Froxel, or in this case, like two Froxels in one Froxel, right? So all that really meant is we need to sample the light half Froxel ahead and half Froxel behind. So within one Froxel, we sample outside area of 2 Froxels. So that way it kind of covers all the different cases. And with temporal, it's easy. We just move the sampling points just a little bit further out of the bounds of the actual Froxel. And in the case, if you wanted to do it like that, multi-sampling and you want reconstruction within one frame, you want to do you do those sampling within the range of the 2 Froxels as expected, except one trick to do is you need to apply proper weighting, proper factor to each one of those samples, because you cannot just blend them with this equal weight. You wanna replicate basically what you would do with temporal, which is like moving them around, and then you can basically give more weight to the points, to the samples. You would hit more versus less, right? So the fringe ones would take only one versus the middle ones in this particular case would multiply by 4, because technically you would take them 4 times as you were doing temporal, and if you were moving around. With that, these artifacts go away very, very nicely. These artifacts completely go away. And by the way, this is actually how it looks in the real game. That was exaggerated. Debug light, it actually was more subtle. But even with the subtle lights like that, you will notice those kind of artifacts. Here's another example screenshot of, you see how there's this thin light shaft, the worst case scenario, thin light shaft that is intersecting thick, deep Froxels. So what's happening is you have this break here, and that's an example kind of what we showed in diagram before, where this is kind of where it's intersecting 2 Froxel versus it's intersecting 1 Froxel. With this expanding sampling, you don't notice that artifact at all. Um, ambient light leaking was another problem we had. Ambient light leaks through walls and things like that. So one solution was to use regions to call probes, right? And basically any Froxel that is within a region. Remember, the regions were processed at the ambient light stage, because they can also tint ambient light, and they are more coarse, they're bigger Froxels. But basically, any Froxel that is within the region or a little bit close to the region nearby, kind of touching it, all those Froxels would only be allowed to call probes that are within that region, right? And that was actually really nice to with the scalar approach of finding those 192 probes, and because then we can actually do really fast processing of checking all those probes against those regions. Because now we just had one scalar list, and we can utilize now 64 threads to work on all of them at the same time, and not like every thread doing the same probe, or like different probes depending on how they grab them, order they grab them. Of course, it requires manual setup. The interesting part was, though, is that actually in many cases where we needed to solve this issue, was actually the cases where we already had some sort of a region in the building anyway. So in many times we used that. The other option was to use kind of black probes to bleed out dark values outside. So the issue is it's the most noticeable problem whenever you have bright ambient coming through the wall into a dark room, right? So if you have dark probes in the wall or close to the wall on the other side, if we just give more weight to dark probes to just kind of expand the darkness out, what's going to happen is you basically the bright ambient is going to push away from the walls. And here's an example where you will see that there was ambient going. This was actually here, right? This is this area here. The ambient was going through the wall here, but if you give more weight to the black dark probes, it will kind of push it away. Other solutions that we tried use depth buffer variance to predict whether or not the probe is behind the geometry or not. And also we could use probe occlusion data that we had baked into the probes to kind of determine whether or not it's close to a wall, or there's a wall between it and the Froxel. They showed promise. They were not. They were too. Though jittery, they showed promise, but they were not consistent results. So ultimately, did not use those. Performance, of course, depends on many different factors, right? Usually the fog was costing us 2 to 3 milliseconds, sometimes 4 milliseconds FPS cost. I spoke to Whalen about who was in charge of kind of like getting us in frame, and figuring out what features to turn on, turn off, and so on. And the fog was not one of those features that was a problem, right? Sometimes we would, whenever it was just highly ambiently or indirectly lit levels, we could lower the resolution just to save a little bit. But ultimately, fog was pretty good. And also don't forget that. Fog results, all those like textures for runtime lights and sun shadow, ambient light, all of those are reused for particle lighting, right? So there's a lot of savings there because we don't do anything else for particles except for just sampling those textures. So 2 to 3 milliseconds was kind of what it cost, sometimes spiking to 4. In this particular case, here we go, like a resolution of grid size is 3.6 million is a 6x6 Froxels screen space. We have pretty sharp God rays going through, and visible with sun is 1.66 million, visible without sun 0.3 million, and blurring 0.11 million Froxels. The cost is 2.1 milliseconds for FPS. It's the raw cost is 3.35 milliseconds if you were to serially execute, but we do overlap it on top of the G buffer. And this is where it's important. This is where it was really important, right? Whenever we overlap on the geometry paths, it's not just enough to write some compute shaders and just overlap them with geometry paths. I mean, it's fine, but what we did, right, is we optimized our shaders for occupancy, right? We wanted to make sure we only put them in the bucket, we only process the things we need, and we put them in the bucket with the shaders, the complexity of the shader that does exactly what we need for those particular Froxels, which meant we can boost the occupancy. In this particular case, you will notice that we are going from 0.39 to 0.61 ALU operations per clock, right? So which means that we increase our performance. So we are adding more work to do, right? But we're also increasing performance of the whole thing. And this is important. You cannot, not every compute shader does that. Not every compute shader overlapping immediately means that it's gonna optimize the GPU performance. But in this particular case, because we do all this work, optimization actually did very well. This is an example of bad case scenario, 3.5 milliseconds, because we have a bunch of runtime lights with shadows pointed at us. We have 4 spotlights with shadow. We have 3 point lights without shadow. We have 1 point light with shadow, and we're using 8x8 grid here, and the cost is 3.5. And that is because we have multiple point lights pointing at us, and spotlights pointing at us. Remember that we pay the higher cost closer to the camera. Another thing we implemented was underwater fog, which was just an interesting thing we added, which was basically because water really needs, uses refraction, we had to composite fog before water, but we would only composite the fog that every Froxel would know it's underwater, and we would only accumulate those Froxels, and then we composite that, then we capture refraction buffer, then we accumulate Froxels that are above water, and then apply them after water, right? So here's the example of and by the way, for alpha objects it all stays the same because everything is rendered in order. So basically just had to add another composite and accumulation pass. We could have accumulated once and into 2 textures, but those accumulation textures are pretty expensive, so we just did it twice, and you end up with a really cool results. And of course we apply absorption, color absorption, extinction to underwater for kind of realistic look. Here's a pretty cool example, like we're lighting this murky water underwater, and visually it looks really, really nice when you can support volumetrics above and below water. Here's another example. We have a spotlight or a volumetric spotlight above water, and we have our own little flashlight underwater, and we see both of those volumetrics happening, which is really nice. Here's an example of sun volumetrics, and we go underwater, and those rays continue, and you can still see fog above water as well. And here, of course, we also support a little tiling texture for caustic effects, so that we can simulate caustics fairly cheaply. It's just a scrolling 2D texture. Well, it's a 3D texture, animated 3D texture, animated 2D texture, basically, that is scrolling and applied in accumulation pass, because we cannot use temporal, of course, with this. It has to be done accumulation pass. So overall, conclusion is we achieved the desired atmospheric look of the effects and the environment. We unified our lighting and compositing of fog with particles, and we really liked, and we really benefited from this pay for what you see approach. It yielded good performance, GPU occupancy wise, performance wise, everything. That gave us really good results. So that's that. Dog is always hiring, so please apply for an interview. We're always looking for new candidates, and also check out the other SIGGRAPH talks. I have one about the GPU effects, and also Howard, Party, Whalen, and Steven have really nice talks as well. Thank you very much for watching this talk, and have a good day.